Hello. Yes. Well, good evening to everybody, and thank you for coming. My name is Conxa Rodríguez, and I will be chairing this event. This is the first of 4 under the title "What is next for Spain and Catalonia?" As you know, Spain and Catalonia are not very good friends now. This has been organized by a group of students, Spanish students here in the London School of Economics, and they like to thank to the LSE and to the Catalan Observatory and the Spanish Society and the Cañada Blanch Center, and as well the Politikon, which is a publication online which will be broadcasting live with the Pais this event to whoever wants to listen from there. During the next 4 weeks, the current constitutional crisis in Spain will be analyzed here under different angles. Today we will start with the historical roots of the problem, and next week they will carry on with the ways out in the law and politics for the problems. And then the number 3, the third, will be the economics and the economy of Spain and Catalonia. And the last one will be the right of self-determination as it stands nowadays in the United Nations. And we all hope that we can learn and we can understand better the current crisis which is happening now in Spain and Catalonia. The organizers like to thank as well to the distinguished panel which is here next to me. John Elliott, Preston and Felipe Fernández-Armesto. They are 3 professors in Spanish students. They don't need any more presentation, but I can say that they are at the top of their league. And this session will last around 90 minutes, and the first 30 minutes will be a debate starting from questions, and I will put to the panel, and after will be 30 minutes for the public. The public will ask to ask specific and short questions. So we can start, let's go. And the historical roots of the current Catalan crisis. Last October, the Spanish Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy said that the Catalan problem is 500 years old, although recently it has been aggravated. So it does take us to the union, that 500 years takes us to the union of Aragon and Castilla, or Isabel y Fernando, the famous wedding who unite the country, if we could say that like that. To you, John Elliott, what did it mean for Catalonia, that wedding?
Well, the wedding which took place in 1469 led to the union of the crowns of Castile and Aragon, and these dynastic unions were very common in early modern and late medieval Europe. It was very normal, and it created what's known nowadays by historians as a composite monarchy. And in the composite monarchy, as it resulted from the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, what happened was that under the terms of the marriage arrangements, Castile kept all its laws and system of government, and the Crown of Aragon, which consisted of Aragon, Valencia, and the kingdoms of Aragon and Valencia, and the Principality of Catalonia, kept its laws and constitutions, the fueros of Aragon and Valencia, the constitutions of Catalonia, so that it was a self-governing crown, and it remained such as a result of the union. And it's ridiculous to talk in terms of the suppression of the Crown of Aragon and its institutions and constitutions in this period. And in fact, that semi-autonomous system of government survives from 1469 and 1479, when Ferdinand comes to the throne of Aragon. That semi-autonomous system of government remains, although with tensions, right up to 1700.
And in the middle of that, we have the 1640 rebellion, yeah, which came El Segadors, which became the hymn of the Catalans, which were against Felipe IV, Felipe IV. And in which way, that's a rebellion of Catalonia against the central government, in which way this 1640 rebellion is similar to the one nowadays?
Huh. Well, 1640 is one of the critical moments in the history of Catalonia. It was a result of rising tensions under this system of composite monarchies, where the king lived in Madrid, and royal absenteeism is a very important element in the history of European societies where you get these composite monarchies. It happens the same, for instance, when James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England and moves from Edinburgh to London, and the Scots begin to complain equally. So there are tensions, and because Spain is involved in endless warfare, international rivalry, the war of the 30 Years' War in the 1620s, 30s and 40s, Madrid, and the government of Madrid, which is run by the Count Duke of Olivares, the favourite of Philip IV of Spain, is putting pressure on the different parts of the Monarquía Española, on Portugal, which is part of the Spanish composite monarchy at this time, ever since 1580, on Valencia, Aragon, and on Catalonia. So there's tremendous tensions building up, especially in the 1620s and 30s, and just at the end of the 1630s, you get the war comes to the frontier. War between France and Spain comes to the Catalan frontier. Olivares tries to mobilize the Catalans to contribute more to the monarchy than they have been contributing in terms of taxation. And there's a tremendous peasant revolt in the spring and early summer of 1640, which leads to the death of the viceroy as he's trying to escape from Barcelona. The Generalitat, led by this charismatic figure, Pau Claris, who's the canon of the Seu d'Urgell, is running the Generalitat, and it's a question of what's to be done next to save Catalan liberties and constitutions, and the only hope is to look to the French for protection. So that the situation that the Royal Army comes in December to attack Barcelona and to try and reconquer Catalonia. For 1 week, the Generalitat declares the independence of Catalonia as an independent republic, but the French are not satisfied with this. They want a protectorate, effectively. So that, in a sense, it is a separatist movement, but only by force majeure. What Claris and the other opponents of Olivares wanted was to change the government in Madrid and get rid of a tyrannical minister. And Olivares at this point doesn't fall, and so the only alternative is to put yourself in the hands of the French, who turn out to be as unreliable as the Castilians and put as much pressure on the Principality as the Castilians had done. And in 1652, there's growing disillusionment with the French, and this disillusionment with France runs right through the history of early modern Catalonia and Spain. And so Barcelona surrenders after a siege in 1652, and we return to the status quo ante, more or less, right up until 1700, when the last monarch of the dynasty of the House of Austria, Carlos II, dies, and you get then the War of the Spanish Succession, the war between Bourbons and Spaniards. I don't know if Felipe would like to add anything.
Well, I obviously, I absolutely agree with everything John has said, and I know that's very boring, because what you really want at an event like this is a lot of conflict. But obviously I defer to John, but I do think it's worth just saying something about those segadores. Because I'm so pleased that John mentioned the parallel with Scotland, because, the Scots also have an anthem. It's not an official national anthem, it's a sporting anthem, but it plays the role of an honorary national anthem. It's Flower of Scotland. And like the segadores, it's a modern confection, but it's also, inspired by and mired in these historical irrelevances, these terrible wars which people fought centuries ago. But the remarkable thing about Flower of Scotland, if you compare it with Los Segadores, is it's terribly pacific and conciliatory. You know, it's all about sending King Edward homeward to think again, and it actually says those days are past, and in the past they must remain. Whereas Los Segadores, well, it's one of my favourite anthems, because I expect many of you know, ladies and gentlemen, it's so delightfully bloody. You know, it's all about chopping people up with sickles.
Yes,
it's rather like, you know, it's violence and bellicosity. Remind one of the Marseillaise, which at times was also used as quasi sort of anthem by Catalan separatists, where, you know, they talk about impure blood filling our troughs. And I just wish, you know, that people would not take these sentiments too literally and uphold, you know, the message of Flower of Scotland, which is that those days are past, and in the past we must remain. A lifetime as an historian has taught me one thing about the past, which is that it's interesting rather than instructive. Yeah, and one mustn't allow, you can only start from where you are, you mustn't allow the practical problems of solving today's difficulties to become bloodied and tainted by these false historical memories.
Moving from Los Segadors, we can stop now in the year 1714.
Yes.
Anybody who has been in the Barcelona Football Club during a match, in the afternoon, the minute comes 1714 and they all shout independence, independence. Yeah. The year 1714 is a defeat for the Catalans.
Absolutely.
But they still are looking at it as a big, very important thing for them. Why do you think that nowadays 1714 is so in the news and in everybody's life?
Well, I think there are one of the obvious reasons is that the War of the Spanish Succession was a civil war, both in Spain and in Catalonia itself, between the Bourbons, who had the right, actually had a more legitimate title, and the House of Austria, Archduke Carlos, the Austrian pretender. And the Catalans made a fatal choice by, in the end, backing the Archduke Charles, with the support of the English and the Dutch, who effectively persuaded them to join in the war. So that you get, and after the Battle of Almansa in 1707, a big defeat for the Archduke's forces, it's clear that Felipe V is going to win, the Bourbon candidate, but the Catalans decide to go on fighting. And the Royal Army, the Bourbon Army, advances on Catalonia in 1713-14, and after a heroic defence, Barcelona surrenders. So that it is a major defeat. Whether Catalonia would become like Portugal, which had got its independence, a satellite of the French, of the English and the Dutch is quite likely, I think. But it didn't work out that way. At that point, the new Bourbon dynasty, which had already eliminated the fueros of Aragon and Valencia, then decides in the Nueva Planta, part of the Nueva Planta, to abolish the constitutions of Catalonia. So it's a massive defeat for Catalan liberties. It's the end of a composite monarchy based on an acceptance of semi-autonomy of part of the monarchy. Now, I think the other thing to emphasize about 1714 is, I think one of the reasons why it's picked up and been so important in the last few years is, of course, because of the commemoration of the in 2014, and Artur Mas, in fact, picks up that. I mean, he could have picked up the Pau Claris business, but we already know that Catalonia was very divided in 1640. I tried to point this out in my book on the revolt of the Catalans in that period. You get the same divisions actually in 1714, but it leads, it becomes valuable because all the modern Catalan movement is based, like all nationalist histories, on a manipulation of the past, an acceptance. Some of the past is correct, some of the past is slanted in a particular way, but it does lead to this sense of victimismo, of victimization of Catalonia, which persists from 1714 up to today.
Now, Question to three of you. When do you think that the modern Catalan nationalism is dating? When it started? It has been now few similarities with the civil wars of the 19th century, and they are similar to the problems we are having nowadays. But when you will date it?
You want a specific date?
A month. A month will do.
15th of September 1923.
That's la dictadura de Primo de Rivera.
So, yeah, so they say, yeah. I mean, basically,
That's your bet.
okay, basically, it seems to me, and do not present myself as an expert on this, that the Catalanism of the 19th century, or certainly the second half of the 19th century, is a cultural movement, and it does not constitute a threat to Madrid. And indeed, the elements of Catalan society that are most interested in Catalanism, if I can say that, are basically the haute bourgeoisie. They are the rich, the people who support the La Liga Regionalista. And so basically, they are certainly not a challenge to Madrid because they see Madrid as protecting them from the anarchists. So basically, Catalonia, really from the end of the 19th century onwards, has certainly urban Catalonia is deeply divided. There is a very radical anarchist movement, quite large, which at certain times is a terrorist organisation. And I mean, this is a long story, and I won't go in any detail unless you want me to, but basically, until 1923, the main institutions of the Catalan bourgeoisie, el Foment de Treball Nacional, the Federació Patronal, La Liga Regionalista, they are all, I mean, they think of themselves as broadly Catalanist, but they depend on Madrid for protection. And when Primo de Rivera makes his coup, on the 12th of September 1923, he's seen off at the station at the station to go to get on the train to go from Barcelona to Madrid, and he's seen off by the Puig Calafalch, the president of the Mancomunitat, by Fabra, who is the alcalde, and by 4,000 people. And they go believing that he is going to be the champion of Catalonia. And one of the reasons they think this is because Primo de Rivera, who was a very affable soul, was a great fan of Catalan culture. He liked the sardana. He used to go to aplecs and fiestas and one thing and another. He always made an effort to speak Catalan. To their utter astonishment, within 3 days of getting to Madrid, he reveals himself as a major centralist. Now, the most characteristic figure of Catalanism, Francesc Cambó, was never a separatist. What Cambó always wanted was for Catalonia to be the economic dynamo for the rest of Spain. And actually, although there's a famous letter which he wrote to somebody in which he said that the declaration of the dictatorship, I think he says, fue la única dulzura en muchos años de amargura, or en muchos años amargos. And he then becomes an opponent, and not a very strong one, but he becomes a bit of an opponent. And at that point, there emerges a much more left-wing Catalanism. So this is when Acció Catalana, the people who eventually create Esquerra Republicana de Catalunya, they start to come to the fore. And then, of course, by the time of the declaration of the Republic, on the 14th of April 1931, there is more of a Catalan movement, a Catalanist movement. But I think if you had to find a date, I mean, you could say it's a lot to do with the loss of Cuba. You could say it's a lot to do with the Ley de Jurisdiccions in 1905. There are elements of the Setmana Tragica, and there's all kinds of things. But really, it seems to me that the tipping point is Primo de Rivera.
Can I take him up on one point here? I would say that one of the major events of great importance is there's a shift, in my view, from cultural nationalism to political nationalism, which takes place starting roughly with the sexennial, 1868-74, the coming of the Republic, when lots of new ideas about the reorganization of Spain are coming out into the open, federal solutions and so on, which would include Portugal. And this is taken up very much, obviously, by the Catalan intellectuals in this period. And I'm thinking particularly of Prat de la Riba and his compendi on Catalan nationalism, which I think the first edition must be 1894, and then his La Nacionalidad Catalana in 1906. And there he makes his important pronouncement for the future and for today. He draws a distinction between a nation which is organic, which is Catalonia, and the state, Spain, which is artificial. It's just an estado. And it's this distinction which has run right the way through in certain Catalan intellectual circles. We hear today when the word Spain is not used and the word estado is used in its place, but you can trace that back to the 1890s. And I think that there are these very important ways in which the past is twisted, manipulated for certain purposes, for certain groups. And just one final personal point, I actually met Puig Catafalque. I went to his study and saw him in 1953, I think. He was a pretty mummified figure by then, but I feel a link with the past.
I mean, I don't disagree with that. What I'm sort of letting colour my answer to Concha's question is, at what point is Catalanism a threat to Madrid? Which, in a sense, what you're saying, of course you're right, but I'm not sure it's yet a threat to Madrid.
No. Well, I'll just say something very briefly, because otherwise we'll all be mummified. I think the only thing really I needs to be said is that you did ask us, Concha, when did modern Catalan nationalism begin? And I want to challenge the terms of the question, because I don't think nationalism is modern at all. It's a clapped out 19th century ideology, which for God's sake we should all have outgrown by now. I don't think everything about Spain is marvellous. I think the constitution badly needs serious reform, and the objections that people have in the regions to the present balance of the distribution of power and taxation and the yield of taxation. I mean, all those things I think need to be addressed. But one of the good things about Spain is that it is a very non-nationalist country. Spanish nationalism, thank God, has virtually withered and died. And I think we should celebrate that and be grateful for it. And to me, it's a terrible tragedy that this incubus, this hydra, has raised all its ugly heads around the periphery of the country. And I just wish again that people would forget this, or historians shouldn't urge people to forget the past, but should transcend the past and examine it critically, try to understand it in all its complexity and all its moral ambiguity, but start from where we are today with new solutions, with genuinely modern thinking, and not go back to a lot of 19th century claptrap which never made any sense to begin with.
That's all highly desirable, Felipe, but I mean, this forgets David Davis and Jacob Rees-Mogg and all of the loony nationalists who were behind. It's a very general problem. It's not confined to Catalonia. And the same is true. I have to say that during basically a situation that's got worse since 2006, since the emasculation of the Estatut between 2006 and 2010. I mean, to say that there is no Spanish nationalism, I find it absolutely ferocious. I mean, maybe it's not a representative sample, but the people who I meet and so on. But I find that that a kind of ferociously aggressive nationalism does exist.
Well, it's certainly true. I mean, we better not go on too long about this, but it's certainly true that the language of nationalism has been revived by this debate about, what constitutes a nation. But the answer to this, and I think it's the answer that most Spaniards would give if you were able to tease, coherence out of what is usually a matter that's suffused with emotion. But I think if you could get coherent answers from most of my fellow Spaniards, they'd say, yes, Spain is a nation, so if you're Galician is Galicia, and so is Catalonia if you're Catalan, but it doesn't matter. It shouldn't matter. Because the institutions of the state, we live in a world in which basically we've got, two rival concepts of the state, neither of which makes very good sense. One is, the state is the result of a contract in which, we are all complicit, which is not actually true. That's a falsehood. I would much rather not belong to any state if I were allowed to, and I suspect, a lot of my fellow anarchists feel the same way. And the other concept of the state is that it's based on the nation. It's based in some sense on the coherence of a community which is self-defined as a nation because it has I would define it as a community with inherited characteristics, which are self-defining characteristics, usually of language or historical experience or shared genes. And that is equally false. And so really, the question, I'm happy to go back on and defer to you, Paul, on whether Spanish nationalism exists, but in as much as it exists, it doesn't matter, or at least it shouldn't matter.
And the word is because we have La Renaixença, and La Renaixença is the revival of the Catalan language and the Catalan culture, and that's just before the revival of the politics. So there is a link there. Was La Renaixença and the 19th century, the 19th century, La Renaixença takes place after the revival start in Catalonia, then they become the politics as well. So the question will be, how important is the coherence of a language, of a culture, and La Renaixença being then different than the rest of Spain to build this identity which has brought now in what we have in our face?
Well, this is a pan-European movement around about 1800, when folklorists, writers, poets and so on are exploring their pasts, rediscovering the past, and creating a new sense of community. And one of the parts of this revival, as far as Catalonia is concerned, is the revival of the Catalan language as a respectable language, which takes time and becomes a literary language. But the upper classes, of course, mostly talking Castilian for most of this period. And but it does give a point of reference to all those who are unhappy about the current situation and relations with Madrid. And that, I think, is extremely important, because if you look at Sampari Millo's book of around about 1900, he says, 1714 destroys everything, but it doesn't destroy the language, and language is the basis of our community. And language is the key point of reference, I think, for Catalan nationalism. If you compare it with Scotland, for instance, where Gaelic has no prestige, or very little prestige indeed, this is a major difference. And it's so unpredictable, because the Welsh have the language, but they don't have the political nationalism. So it's very difficult to prophesy how it's going to work out. But the retention of the language and the sense of the language is what's made Catalonia is critical, I think, for understanding what's happening today.
You don't recognise the Scots language?
Well, the Gaelic, yes, but
what about Scots?
Taught by Scots. Well, they were so embarrassed by talking Scots in the later 18th century in Edinburgh, they had elocution classes in English. But I agree that there are obviously differences, and they don't like it to be called a dialect.
No.
Okay. Moving on in the 20th century. We'll not leave the 20th century now. It's a warning for everybody. Many similarities have been drawn with the Republic in 1931, the Declaration of the Republic 1931 in Spain, and then in Catalonia, and the next step, the Estat Català. Where are the similarities there?
Well, I think, you can make comparisons between the establishment of the Republic in April of 1931 and what happened over the next few months in terms of Francesc Macià declared an independent Catalonia, and basically a delegation went from Madrid and negotiated, and a deal was made. You can't separate Spain, but we guarantee there will be an autonomy statute, and so there was an amicable deal made because there was a reasonable government in Madrid. After the first elections of June 1977, in a way, a similar deal was made, between Elliott, leaving aside the kind of theatre of Ja Sóc Aquí and all that business. Basically, it's very reasonable. He thinks it's crucial to get some recognition of Catalonia. Suarez, who is obviously the Prime Minister, agrees, and they make a deal. So in that sense, there's a similarity. When there is a readiness to talk, solutions can be found. What happens, of course, is that if we go back to the Republic, in October of 1934, there is a right-wing government established. There's the uprising in Asturias, and Companys declares independence, and of course the Catalan rebellion is crushed within 10 hours, without violence, interestingly, because the Captain General of Barcelona, Domingo Batet, is a Catalan, and of course for this he's executed by Franco later on. But nonetheless, that attempt at establishing an independent Catalonia is crushed, and then and the equivalent, of course, well, not the equivalent, this is putting it too strongly, the limitations on independence in the transition period begin with the whole business about diluting, the café para todos, the diluting Catalan and Basque autonomy by creating 17 autonomías, of which a considerable number, certainly into double figures, don't have a lot of historical, so there are similarities. But if I had to draw one conclusion, it is when there are elements in both Barcelona and Madrid prepared to negotiate, things get settled.
And now, do you think any chances of that?
Oh, no.
The current revival of the Catalan nationalismo independentist as it is now has occurred during an economic recession. That's, if you look back at the history as many centuries and you learn, it's a pattern than where is an economic recession, nationalism, revivals.
It can happen because very often at moments of great recession, deep recession, there are opportunist politicians who see the possibilities. But it doesn't have to go in tandem with economic depression and upsurge of nationalism. There are many other elements that come into play. There's a question of personalities and charismatic personalities, for instance. There's a question of if things are going very well. If you discover Scottish oil, then you think you can become an independent Scotland again, because the economy is going on the up. So I don't see economics as the most decisive factor, actually, in the upsurge and then the decline of nationalism.
Yes, it's not the economy stupid.
No.
And it's got far more to do with what I think you call culture than it has to do with economics. So the paradox is that you can have a revolution which is inspired by economic depression or decline, and that often happens in time of war, which strains the economy, as it was the case in 1640, and it can happen as a result of a global economic meltdown, as has happened recently, and has deeply affected the relationship of Catalonia to the rest of Spain. But you can also have a révolution née de la prospérité, and to some extent, Catalan and Scottish cases are cases of that. You've got relatively rich communities who can afford the luxury of taking the economic risks that the independence movement in Catalonia has involved.
Well, I think so. I think that one of the things that a problem with a debate like this is that inevitably we're looking in terms of a clash between Catalonia and Madrid. And there are elements, Catalonia itself is divided. One of the reasons why, it's not the only one, of course, but one of the reasons why Companys makes the Declaration of Independence in October 1934 is actually because the forces that will come into power on the 6th of October, their Catalan equivalents have been blocking agrarian reform within Catalonia. So, it's always more complicated than it seems.
And one of the things which has brought up the crisis which is nowadays happening is what they call the spirit of 78, the Constitution and Agreement of 78. And it seems that it needs a replacement. What's your opinion on that? Is the spirit of 78 is finished? Is possible to replace?
Well, I have to say, having lived through that period and been involved in various ways, I still think that the transition was a minor miracle. Coming as it did after 38 years of the Francoist dictatorship, with powerful elements within the Franco regime who did not want to see change, an army that had been trained to believe that its primordial task was to prevent democracy and to crush the left, the civil guard, 200,000 falangistas with licencias de armas, all of that, to reach a negotiated transition, I think was little short of a miracle. Inevitably, of course, things change, but I think they are wrong. Those who nowadays look back and say, oh, the transition was a disaster, it wasn't revolutionary enough or whatever. I think in terms of what was possible in the period from 1975 to, well, basically till, it's difficult to say, but certainly until the Tejerazo, I think it was quite remarkable. So has the spirit gone? Well, it would be foolish, it seems to me, to look at Spain today and the democracy that Spain is with all its problems. Is Spain more or less democratic than Britain? When we hear all this tripe about the British people have spoken, the idea that when a decision's made, you could just imagine if the Labour Party won an election, that the Tories will say, okay, well, they've won, they'll be in power forever now because the British people have spoken. There are wonderful things about Spain that go back to the transition, and I think it would be wrong to say, oh, it's all a disaster and it's all a mess, and there's no longer. The idealism of and the hope of the period from the first elections to the passing of the Constitution, it would be difficult to keep that alive, but I still think that there's an important legacy there.
But has been a lot of talk after the people have been put in prison, and on the 1st of October the police was sent them to beat up whoever wanted to vote. Has been a lot of talk that Franco methods are coming back.
But the equation of Spain since 1978 with the Franco period today, is absolutely ridiculous. If anybody who'd lived through in Catalonia in the Franco period, it was extremely repressive. It was horrific. And frankly, Catalonia's never had it so good as between 1978 and 2008.
Yes, I agree. I mean, those, with the exception of Concha, of course, I hope my fellow panelists won't, reprimand if I say we're rather old. And for those of us who lived through that era and who experienced it, the settlement of 1978 is too precious to despise, and it obviously needs modification. It needs constant vigilance. It needs to be updated. I agree wholeheartedly with what Paul said about the folly of rejecting the 14 clauses of the Statute of Catalonia without a more reasonable dialogue. I mean, all of those things have gone badly. I also agree that it's mad to put people in prison, but it's just, you've got to think back to what it was like at the time. And if you can, again, it's what I was saying earlier about when you look at the past, try to retrieve what it was really like. Try to sympathise with the feelings of the people at the time, and then you'll come to value the settlement of 1978 the way we elders do.
But is the time to change the constitution? I mean,
yes.
The Spanish democracy is able to talk, not to vote, to talk yes. about the unity yes. of the country.
Yes, well, the
main parties have no policy on that.
If it were possible to achieve rational constitutional reforms, then the debate about the unity of the country would despair.
I mean, theoretically, it is possible. There are clauses in the Constitution which say that it is possible to hold a referendum, but a nationwide referendum on possible reform of the Constitution. The problem is that so much division has been generated that it would be very difficult to get that. But I mean, legally, it is possible. And one of the problems, of course, is everything being the legality, that everything that happened from the 1st of October and subsequently, I mean, 1st of October of this year, a lot of people in the rest of Spain say, well, it's the law. It's really, in a sense, I find it quite funny, the people who would not regard, there was law under Franco. Franco passed laws. They were passed by the Cortes. There was a Francoist constitution. Now, those of us who opposed Franco did not regard those laws as legitimate or cast in stone and whatever. So it's a bit odd that now things are done. I mean, it's terribly difficult because we see things here from in this case from England, and the idea that someone would be threatened with 30 years in prison for holding a consultation seems outrageous. Seen from Spain, it's the law, and it's interesting how people have suddenly acquired an amazing reverence for the law that they didn't have while corruption was taking place on both sides of the Ebro.
Well, all that is true, but you would agree, wouldn't you, Paul, that there's a difference between respect for the law in a dictatorship, which one shouldn't have, and respect for law in a democracy, which one should. And even, someone who's a visceral anarchist like me recognizes that in a democracy, we in order to have a viable, peaceful society, we are obliged to respect the laws we don't agree with.
Absolutely. And I mean, so what we have is a confederacy of dunces.
Well, I think one of the things that's happened in all this is what we might call the political and moral bankruptcy of the two major parties in Spain, which has left a vacuum, makes it much more difficult to produce any serious reforms, because these parties have become dinosaurs effectively. And although new ideas are coming forward, so far they haven't managed to impose themselves. It's going to be very difficult to change the constitution because of the various arrangements. In some ways, we benefit in this country from having no written constitution, which allowed Cameron, for good or ill, to offer the Scots a referendum in a way that Madrid couldn't offer a referendum to the Catalans. But I think that bankruptcy of the two major parties is creating a totally new situation at this moment. And we're between two eras, as it were, and until a new generation takes over with fresh ideas. And I don't know that federalism is the right answer for Spain. I mean, federalism is a very, it all depends how it's interpreted. There's confederalism, there's federalism, and so on. And so one has to be very cautious about how one tackles these things. But new ideas are needed, and they're not yet forthcoming.
In the modern democracy, as we could say from 77, the election 77 until now, in Catalonia always has been the 8% of the population voting independent, which was the ones who used to vote Esquerra Republicana. Esquerra Republicana is a party of 80 years old, which has been always independent. But in the last election, it was 47% of the people voting. Why do you think has been this big change in the last few years?
It was 47% of those who voted.
Both for parties which are in favour of
but not 47% of the people. 47% of those voting. I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah, and nearly 80% was the turnout.
Well, yeah, I think there's all kinds of reasons. In a way, oddly, I think there are astonishing parallels between the whole Brexit business and what's happened in Spain. Mm-hmm. I think that there's an accumulated resentment that, just as in the north of England there's a deep accumulated resentment of London that in a way blames London and I think rightly probably blames the political elite for all kinds of problems, to an extent of total blindness, that in order to put one over on the London elite votes in a way that is actually very damaging. And I wonder, I don't know because I don't live in Catalonia, I wonder if there isn't perhaps some element of that within. And of course, there's also a reaction to what's happened in Madrid. So let me make a hypothesis. I mean, I have to say, and I wish we'd had the opportunity to say, I mean, and I think my colleagues would agree, you know, we have enough trouble interpreting the past without trying to interpret the present and the future. But anyway, well, we're here, so...
Look at the future, looking at the past as well.
But it seems to me, I mean, this is utterly hypothetical. Obviously, in my view, the problems really start when the Estatut, which has been approved by the Catalan and by the Cortes, has been approved, and it is then challenged in the Constitutional Tribunal. If both sides had wanted agreement, so, you know, if Rajoy had had the sense to ask me what to do, what I would have said is, okay, you can say to Puigdemont, don't be ridiculous, you can't have a referendum, but you can have a consultation. And if, big if you get a turnout of 80% of the vote, and of that turnout, a 60% vote in favour of independence, then we can talk. We can talk about, you know, some kind of negotiation about autonomy. And I actually think that Puigdemont, well, the independentistas in general, made a mistake in challenging, you know, they kind of put themselves in the wrong in the eyes of those who were sensitive to the kind of interpretation of what was going on of the bulk of the Spanish press. You know, and I think that's an important thing. I mean, one of the things that when you hear all the time in Spain, you know, the Catalans have stolen this, that, and the other. Does no one ever look at the way Madrid has grown since 1978? You know, the idea that somehow Catalonia is this great parasite that sucks wealth from the rest of Spain, I would suggest, you know, have a closer look at the GDP of Madrid since 1978. You know, but
okay. Now I will put the last question, and after we will pass to the panel. Looking at this crisis from the future, still the past, is this the biggest test of the Spanish democracy, the challenge from the Catalans? in 40 years? Or
Yes.
Yeah, all right, go on.
Well, there's a conflict of principles here because, you know, to some extent, democracy and the rule of law are in conflict. I mean, clearly there's no democratic mandate for independence in Catalonia, but there is a very substantial minority who have voted for independence parties, and that's a problem which the central government ought to be taking seriously and addressing. I think precisely in the way Paul has suggested. In fact, I did say this some time ago in on the government took no notice of me. So I sympathise with your sense of exclusion. Here. But there's a conflict between two principles. One is democracy, which says that, if everybody's in favour of Brexit, we go for Brexit. And there's another, which is the rule of law, without which democracy is always likely to degenerate into some form of tyranny. And somehow one needs to balance these two conflicting principles. And I think the Spanish Constitution does do a fairly good job of that, and it just needs a serious re-examination, serious tweaking in order to make it continue to be viable for the future.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And we'll put now the panel, and we can start to anybody who likes to put a question to any of them or to three of them. I will take by the gentleman with the glasses. Yes. There's microphone. No. Try to keep all the question short and specific, and we will fit as many as we can.
Thank you for this fantastic talk. My name is Tony, and my question is about not just the tension between Spanish and Catalonia, but also the tension within Catalonia. And because this social divide, my question is, whether the solution not only is maybe the reform of the constitution, but also have the Catalans agree on a new statute of autonomy. The two sides that today they clearly disagree on everything. If they had a chance to have a new statute of autonomy and settle their own disagreement at home in Catalonia, then that would be a great start for a good feature of Catalonia in the state.
Well, I mean, personally, but again, I really mean it when I say I'm not an expert on this, and I don't live in Catalonia, and therefore, I see things very much at a distance. In a way, I think that, attitudes change, and they change almost day on day. That a lot of the sentiment is a reaction to the way Madrid has behaved. There's also, I think, there's been a change. I don't know, but I think there's also been a change within Catalonia, that the people who might have thought independence was a good idea, and then when they realise what the economic consequences were, will have changed their minds. So, I think and because views are changing all the time, and because it's also in a context in which, so far, Madrid has shown little desire to negotiate. All of the examples I gave before, things worked when there were people in Madrid and people in Barcelona who were prepared to negotiate. And the solutions or the hopes that Felipe has expressed depend on that. And there is not, those interlocutors don't exist at the moment.
I think it has to be recognised that there have always been divisions in Catalonia. Vicente Vives, in the Noticia de Catalunya, for instance, draws this distinction between mountainous Catalonia and the sea Catalonia, and that runs right the way through in the civil wars of the 19th century and so on. And so there is this continuing tension. And what we're seeing now about Tabarnia is the industrial Catalonia of the coast.
And the electoral results, the interior is much more independent.
That's right.
Than the...
Yeah.
But of course the question was well conceived, because one of the reasons why the PP thought they could ignore the Statute was because so few people in Catalonia actually voted for it. But in a curious way, I think the crisis has created a lot of momentum in favour of the Statute, and probably it doesn't need a lot of reform. It's really a question of finding a way of making it compatible with the Spanish Constitution.
That one at the end. It was one over there, but I forgot who to look.
Okay, so Mr. Preston, well, first of all, thank you for the talk. Second, that I would say that the parasite discourse started in Catalonia, not in Spain. Spania's Roba, it was one of the logos of the campaign. But what I wanted to ask is, sometimes I feel like you are trying to legitimate the actions of Puigdemont, Mas, etc. Which, I mean, I understand the reasoning behind them. But don't you think that it should be the independentist field, the one giving a step back, taking into account that they are trying to earn leverage against the state by declaring unilateral independence? Don't you think it's kind of unfair? Don't you think it's kind of using a declaration of independence to gain leverage against a government you don't like, something legitimate under a democratic constitution? Shouldn't they be the ones trying to dialogue instead of the Madrid government, which should also try to dialogue, by the way?
Yes. I mean, I'm certainly shocked that you think that I have tried to legitimate, I don't know where you got that from. If you know, the point I make in the few articles I've written about this, and everything I've said anytime I've done a radio or a TV interview about it, is it takes two to tango. And basically we have a situation in which both sides, because, that's why I said, es una conjura de necios. There is idiocy on both sides with intention, because I think there's electoral benefit to be derived in Spain, or in the rest of Spain I should say, from anti-Catalanism. I think, but the idea that I don't think that Puigdemont has done the right thing at any stage. I said what I thought should have happened. There should have been a debate over a consultation which would have clarified the points of view of both sides.
The gentleman mentioned a slogan, which is España no roba, which is the slogan of the independentists. But we have the slogan on the other side, is a por ellos. So if you simplify, it's the two slogans of the crisis nowadays. One there at the end of the corner, and after the one, after, stay there.
I was very intrigued to hear about the comparison between Scotland and Spain, because funny enough I wrote my dissertation on the comparison of Moa Blandner and of the Act of Union which occur in 1707 1714. So I just wanted to learn from far more learned academic minds how far you think that comparison should be drawn between the Scottish example which you raised in certain circumstances and that of Catalonia.
Well, I think between 1707 and 16 is, I think, a great dividing line between the British composite monarchy and the Spanish composite monarchy. The Spanish composite monarchy, now you get an incorporating union in which one part of that monarchy loses its rights and privileges. In 1707, there's a treaty of union between England, ruled by Queen Anne, and Scotland, ruled by Queen Anne. And after a great deal of difficult negotiation, the Scots abandon their parliament and get seats in the House of Commons, but are left in return with their own legal system and their own ecclesiastical system, the Kirk, the Church. And this preserves a large degree of the autonomy of Scotland, which is effectively self-running, although with tensions with London, right up to the 20th century. So that I think at that point, 1707 to 16, is the real divergence between the experience of the two countries. In fact, I'm just going to publish a book this summer on Scotland and Catalonia, from the Middle Ages up to Puigdemont.
This isn't going to help you with your dissertation, but I do think it relates to the question which was asked by the gentleman at the back in the middle, because in a curious way, I think that it's better to look at a sort of Europe-wide context here. Because to me, a really odd thing is that if you look at the other Western European democracies, which have similar problems, like the Liga Nord in Italy, the Belgian problem, the Czech-Slovak divorce, the Scottish independence, in all of these cases, the independence movements, in the case of the Czechs and Slovaks, were sort of mutual independence, in all of these cases, those problems have been dealt with by negotiation within the law. And the only places in Europe where these sorts of movements have led to unilateral declarations of independence have been in Ukraine, where you've had provinces of Ukraine detaching themselves and wishing to join up with Russia, and Kosovo. So does Catalonia really want to be like the Crimea? Or would it rather be like Scotland?
The one with the glasses, the blue shirt.
Hi, good afternoon. My question goes to Professor Preston. Don't you think it's an unfair simplification to speak about a clash between Catalonia and Madrid? What about the rest of Spain? Because unfortunately or not, the rest of Spain votes every 4 years through the central government. So what about Andalusia? What about the north of Spain?
What about it?
I mean, I think it's quite unfair to speak about a clash between the central government in Madrid and Catalonia, because the other parts of Spain are just like where they are, because they support the actions of central government every 4 years. Because if the rest of Spain wants like a separation or a referendum, they could vote for every 4 years. And when you speak about Madrid and Catalonia, you are putting, as my colleague said, at the same level, Madrid and Catalonia, and I don't think so. I think it's unfair because it's a central government, it's a country against a region.
Well, we are gathered here today, dearly beloved, in order to talk about the relationship between Catalonia and the rest of Spain and Madrid. So that's why we're talking about it. I'm not at all sure that there is an equivalence between, if we look at the 17 autonomous regions, of course the relations between Logroño, La Rioja, and Madrid, or Cantabria and Madrid, or Madrid and Madrid, bearing in mind that Madrid is an autonomous region, I don't think they're comparable. I mean, it would be wrong, it seems to me, to pretend that there isn't something very specific about what is going on between Madrid and Catalonia. It would equally be wrong to pretend that there aren't massive problems within Catalonia, massive divisions, and so on. But clearly there's a problem, and as Felipe was saying earlier, in terms of the issue between the rule of law and if you like, the desire of a substantial number of people for change, that is something that needs to be dealt with. What you can't do is just say, 3 million people or whatever it is want autonomy, to hell with them. You need to negotiate. Something has to be done, it seems to me, that's all. And I cannot see a comparison between Madrid and any other autonomous region and Madrid and Catalonia, but I can be wrong. It's in fact my speciality.
Dos aquí, después nos vamos para allá. ¿Tú?
Hello. Thank you very much. I would like to ask, why did a nationalist movement a cultural nationalist movement became a political nationalist movement in Catalonia, and this did not happen in Valencia or in Mallorca as much? So, using this as counterexamples, what are the differences? What are the key differences between these regions?
Okay.
Well, again, if we go back to, I don't know whether my colleagues read, but if we take my point that the real tipping point that makes Catalanism truly political is the anti-Catalanism of the Prima de Rivera dictatorship. There is no equivalent for Valencia. Valencia did not have the it didn't have the economic preeminence that Catalonia had at the time. So,
Now, a question to this lady, and after we go to that corner because.
Yes, thank you, the three of you, for your very interesting comments. My question my comment is a bit strange because it is to all of you as historians. I find that both nationalists and the debate in the media, and every time we talk about Catalonia, the debate is too history loaded. And sometimes I miss a historian saying, maybe history doesn't explain everything. You shouldn't look back into history, and everything that has happened in Catalonia has to do with political decisions that were taken from 2008 on. I mean, that is history as well, but we don't have to go back to the 15th century, the 16th century, because in 2006, not even 20% of the Catalonian population was in favor of independence. So history was not that present there. And when things happen, we tend, and it's also the media that do it, but we tend to explain everything with history. And I think you are authorities in the field of history, and I would like to know whether you yourselves think that sometimes we put too much.
Well, I might be expected to sympathise with the questioner because I said something very similar myself repeatedly during the debate on the platform. But I'll tell you why one does need to take the past into account. It is in order to demythologise the falsehoods and the lies on which present political debate is based. If I can hazard another parallel, this time with Ireland. A few years ago, I was with Peter Burton, a very distinguished historian, and we walked around Belfast, and there are all these, murals, and we were looking at these marvellous unionist murals with pictures of King Billy, and the legend always says, "Remember the Boyne." And Peter said to me, "I wish they'd forget the bloody Boyne." And I said, "But you're a historian, you can't tell people to obliterate the past." And of course, what we really should forget are the false versions of the past on which distort these current debates. And I think, the Boyne distorts the debate in Ireland just as much as the 1714 or 1640 do that in Catalonia.
A question now at the end.
Thank you so much. It has been mentioned several times that if there is a willingness to talk, a deal could be made. My question is, what kind of deal? As far as I'm aware, Catalonia is one of the most autonomous regions in Europe. It has control over education, it has control over the health system, it has its own police force, it has a recognized culture, its own language. So what can Spain offer apart of independence through an illegal referendum? Thank you.
well, as I say, it's like all of these things, depends at what point you want to start the debate. If we go back to 2006, 2008, I think things would have been very different. I mean, all the things that you list, the Basque Country has. What is the difference? The Basque Country has control over its taxation. And that's probably the biggest single difference. Oddly, the things that caused most distress or most ostensible distress about the decisions made by the Tribunal Constitucional or Tribunal de Garantías Constitucionales in 2010 were the removal of a statement that Catalonia was a nation, which, if you like, is a cultural point. It probably didn't harm anyone specifically. As I say, I think the problem now is it is too late. My hypothetical solution might have worked, in 2006, 2008, 2010, maybe even in September of 2017. But I think it's too late now.
Can I just add one point here? That if I look into the future, it seems to me that the pluralism of Spain, which is recognized by the Constitution, has not been fully recognized. And one thing you could do is to accept the 4 languages of Spain and make them, put them on a par with each other. Educate people. People should have classes in Catalan, in Castilian schools, and in Gallego and so on. At least get some idea of the other cultures.
Here at the front. Okay, yes, you both.
First of all, thank you very much for your conference. Some words have been said about the uses and abuses of history by Catalan independentists and nationalists, but I would like to ask all of you at the table about the uses and abuses on history by humanists from Madrid. Like we had the Spanish Prime Minister a few weeks ago saying Spain is the most ancient nation of Europe or something like that. Like Spain dates back 5 centuries. And to which extent is the response by the Spanish government, and giving this in a role, legal response, and to which extent does it rely upon manipulation of history?
Manipulation of history.
Yeah, I mean, politicians do this all the time. Watch the news any night in this country when you will have a government spokesman telling downright lies that about, there's a crisis in the NHS. No, that can't be true. We've given them oodles of money. Politicians, their default position is to tell lies. And I think it is our duty, as especially if you're a contemporary historian, to do your research and try to reach valid conclusions. So when there are people who say, and lots of politicians do to this day in Spain, that the military coup of 18th of July 1936 was not illegitimate, that the dictatorship was not illegitimate, that to want to know about the people who were murdered during the Civil War is remover las cenizas or remover las cendras. It is, maybe it's not John Elliott's duty because he deals with a different period, but it is my duty, it's what I do for a living, is try to get at the truth. And so in my case, so I would be regarded as someone of the left. But people weren't pleased when I wrote a book examining the crimes of Santiago Carrillo. I would like to think that as a historian, I try to find the truth, whoever, caiga quien caiga. Which is usually me, of course.
I would like to say some opinion about history, obviously, helps to explain. But as long as you don't recognize the situation, you don't recognize the other, you won't be able to even think about to find any solution. Which is hard to remember that we have a prime minister in Spain that started his career as prime minister giving a press conference through screens, TV screens. So it's very difficult to find a solution if you have another one that don't respect you as subject. And talking about subjects, I would like to ask all of you, but maybe especially Professor Preston, what do you think about the position of the actual current monarch that ignores in the recent speeches part of their subject, and considering that the monarchy should have, let's say, a neutral
the role of the king,
so if you don't even recognize as a monarch of that so-called state part of your subjects, and try to open a way to start talking.
With the question of the role of the king in the crisis, did you, probably all of you saw his speech?
I mean, it is easy to understand why any monarch would not favour the separation of part of his kingdom. That goes without saying. But oddly enough, the night that Felipe, not this one, the king, made his speech, at the time when that evening, I was actually doing an interview on the BBC, and I had to go off and do a lecture somewhere else. And the interviewer said, you know, the King's going to make a speech in an hour or so. Could you stay? And I said, I really, you know, I wish I could, but I can't. And he said, well, what do you think he's going to say? And I said, well, on the basis of the way I think his father would have behaved, I think and I hope he'll make a conciliatory speech. And I have to say I was quite shocked by how hardline it was. Now, I don't know who wrote the speech. I don't know whether, you know, and it's always very difficult with a constitutional monarch, you know, what they say in public and so on. But I personally didn't think it was helpful because, as I keep saying, you know, the only chance of any solution on this is negotiation. You know, you can't just say, oh, you know, there's 3 million people want something and they're wrong, so to hell with them. You know, there has to be negotiation.
You want to add something about it? Because we are going into the last question. We have to empty the room, so I'm sorry for the ones. The last question is the gentleman in second line.
Hello there. First of all, to Professor Fernández, as you can see, Spanish nationalism is alive and well in the room, so no problem there.
No, I haven't heard any Spanish nationalism.
Me neither.
You must have been at a different debate from me.
I must have been the question is initially just this very easy question. You said earlier that there was no democratic mandate for independence. Now, stand up and be counted. What's going on here? My maths are not right. Twice Catalonia voted pro-independence parties as majority, yet you said there's no democratic mandate for referendum or independence. Don't really understand that. And then to Professor Preston, who I had the pleasure to speak to him many times, you imposed strangely when he said about the numbers of a referendum with the vote, he said 80% turnout, 60% for yes. Now that's not been imposed on Scotland, that's not been imposed on Quebec. Why?
No, it was imposed on Quebec.
Yeah.
And
80%.
the idea that, I mean, Cameron's decision to let the Scottish referendum and the Brexit referendum be on the basis of 50% plus one were two of the biggest idiocies committed by a man who clearly specialised in idiocy. So the only way it seems to me that you can, you know, in the case, let's take the Brexit one. If Remain had won, we'd be still having the same problems because the Brexiteers would go on fighting. If, on the other hand, I mean, it's only a personal opinion, but if you have a qualified majority that is indisputable, then you've got more chance of the result sticking. Now, that doesn't mean to say that the people who lose just get ignored. I mean, you know, if politics isn't an ongoing negotiation, it slides towards dictatorship. And
I obviously agree with that, and I'm certainly not going to respond to your invitation, sir, to comment on your sanity. I leave that to experts. Your question seemed to me to be entirely sensible. But you know, the reason why there's no democratic mandate is, in the first place, there's no majority in favour of it. You know, 47% is not a majority. I mean, maybe your sanity needs examination. Maybe my mathematics does. But 47% is not a majority, and in any case, that was a vote in favour of a group of different parties. It's absolutely clear that the majority of Catalans are not at present in favour of independence. They are complaining, in my opinion, validly, about the present constitution, about the rejection of the Estatut, or elements of the Estatut, and about the balance of fiscal policy in Spain. And those are all just grievances which ought to be addressed. And in any case, you know, Paul is quite right. No civilized country has ever had a constitution, except Turkey, which is susceptible of being radically changed in a way that sacrifices interests and rights of citizens without a very substantial majority, because when you change the constitution, you are mortgaging the future of subsequent generations, and that is why it is always necessary to be absolutely certain before you do anything like that, that there is a genuine and enduring consensus, and without that there is no democratic mandate.
We need to go.
Well, to Chris, I agree.